we're live, and it's time to talk about the Chinese Navy moving all across the world and basically just taking over everything. So, it started, I guess it was a Wall Street Journal article talking about a new Chinese naval base that's going to be set up, or supposedly being set up, or is planned to be set up, or is in the process, or whatever, in the Atlantic Ocean, which is a great way to freak out the entire U.S. Political and military establishment. So it's a really smart thing to do, I guess, depending on what you want. But yeah, this is what happened. And now we're getting op-eds coming in Bloomberg and other places just about how this is the start of a grand Chinese plan to conquer the world and basically have the exact same position that the United States has, blah, 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 blah. So actually, the article in Bloomberg is by a guy named James Stavridis. And it's actually kind of a perfect guy to start talking about this. So James was was a U.S. Navy admiral, and for a while he was Supreme Commander of NATO. He ran U.S. Southern Command, which is a fleet based out of Florida, and kind of focuses on Central America and the Caribbean and South America, that kind of part. So the U.S. Navy, the U.S. military in general, is structured into all these different regions, basically commands for different parts of the world, and each there's a southern one, there's a Pacific one, there's a blah blah blah, there's all this stuff. And so that's the sort of set of experiences that this admiral comes up with when he's describing what China's up to. And he's also he was really important. I mean, Stavridis might be a sort of vice presidential candidate for Hillary Clinton. He ran sort of did, or at least participated in strategic planning efforts for the Navy back probably 2008, 2012 range. Then he went to the Tufts Fletcher School of Diplomacy, which is kind of a big school for people who want to be diplomats, stuff like that. And yeah, so he's got this big set of experiences, and he goes into this article using this Atlantic naval base, potential Chinese Atlantic naval base, to describe what China might be up to, what it could do, how this relates to other things. And this is important. So what I'm going to do in this quick sort of live stream is just talk about this U.S. military hysteria about China. We talk about the specific country they're thinking is going to be the heart of a new major naval base. We're going to talk about how this is Americans always thinking other countries are just like America or like the British Empire before. And yeah, I mean, how there's good reason for all this stuff. Like the U.S. Navy, very powerful, very strong, strongest ever compared to any other Navy, but not compared to the past U.S. Navy. And also it's just been completely out of whack. Like the U.S. Navy is the key sort of military branch of the United States, and it's been totally moribund since like the 1990s. And someone like James Stavridis, who's seen what the Navy's not done and what it's failed at, all its military acquisition failures and all this stuff. I mean, he justifiably, him and other admirals know they've dropped the ball. They've just missed what's going on, and they actually know kind of what the U.S. is about, what the Navy, what the military should be doing. So they see the potential of a country like China if it executed on a certain strategy, and they freak out, which is not wrong if China could actually pull it off. So then we're gonna pull all this into just talking about like how does a country decide what its military looks like, right? We're all saying, China's gonna have this grand globe-spanning navy and it's gonna do this and that and all this other stuff. It's like, okay, when has China ever had a navy like that? When have most countries ever even tried to create navies in general? Like, how do countries decide? China has over 2 million people in its military and its army, and the Chinese military is actually called the People's Liberation Army. So it's the People's Liberation Army Air Force, People's Liberation Army Navy. Maybe this is a sign that the Navy isn't the core here. Maybe it is more of an army situation in China for very good reasons that have been true forever in history. So that's what we'll touch on. I can't really get into all of it now. And then we'll say that what China's actually doing right now, what these articles and all this hysteria is really showing people who are around these issues, is what the U.S. military itself and the U.S. Navy in particular should be about. And it's forcing the U.S. to sort of remember or to sort of get back on the path that's sort of set for it again by geography and history. So that's what we're going to talk about. So let's really get into it. So this Bloomberg article by Stavridis, he's goes into all sorts of good stuff. He talks about the U.S. Navy is kind of showing U.S. naval strategy has been bad, but he shows what the U.S. has done, how it's set up all these different various sort of naval bases and depots and all sorts of things around the world to refuel and give it access to different maritime basins, trade routes, all this kind of stuff. There's a lot to go into here. He specifically focuses on a sort of military thing. He thinks it's all about, coaling stations and all this kind of stuff. And the person that you bring up in this context is a guy named Alfred Thayer Mann, who was basically a friend, associate of, what was his name? President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, back in like 1900 era. This is when the United States was really trying to figure out what the country was. Now it had just become a continental scale country. It had Alaska. It had two coasts on either side. I mean, it had three coasts. It had a sort of Gulf Coast. It had the Pacific Coast, and it had an Atlantic coast. And it was trying to figure out what to do. What sort of military do you create? Who do you emulate? Do you copy the British? Do you copy the French? Do you copy the Russians? Like, what do you actually do? And so a guy like Alfred Mann, he actually was really thinking about this stuff, and he came up specifically with a sort of sea power first, a sort of Navy first concept. And that's actually what Teddy Roosevelt was about. This is when something called the Great White Fleet flew all, went all around the world, and it was, big sort of imperialist early America trying to figure out who we are, trying to figure out what we're going to be, what we're going to, how to like sort of show we're getting on the world stage kind of thing. That whole thing was going on. And a lot of the U.S. Navy in particular, like the U.S. Navy, sort of military schools, military academies, they're very focused on this guy and his theories, because there's a whole set of all these geopolitical theories about how things work. And just based on the British Empire and just based on how the United States succeeded, the Navy kind of side of things often won. But there's a lot more to this that we can't really get into here. But this stuff's really interesting. And so when he's talking about this stuff, it's not entirely wrong. It's just not giving you the full picture. So he's talking about, well, China's trying to form a naval base in Equatorial Guinea, which is basically a small petro-state on the side of West Africa. How it should maybe trying to add a military component to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is was seen as geoeconomic, which is also not entirely right. But you can see how this all comes together. Oh, there's a giant infrastructure and development program going all around the world, and why don't we pair military type stuff along with that? That makes sense. And that's kind of what's going on. So he's saying, maybe you'll put, the U.S., we have bases in Australia and Djibouti and Japan, South Korea, all around the world. Not like huge military bases. All this stuff about the U.S. having like 800 military bases is really not the way to think about it. It's not the right sort of perspective, especially when like all it takes to make a military base, like you and three friends could go to some rural place and work really hard over a weekend and like make an airstrip, just flatten a bunch of ground, put some stuff on it, and make it sufficient for like a relatively rugged plane to land on. And you could put up some tents, and you could call this a military base. That's not really what it is, right? Saying you have 800 military bases when most of them can't support any operations, they're meant to do other things. It's intended to sort of talk about the scale of the U.S. military and how it's excessive and how it needs to be scaled back. That's fine, but it should be just recognized that is what that number is kind of for. There's very few real foreign U.S. military bases that are of any consequence. But this is very different. And so you have someone, the Stavridis guy, who was, he's focused on Southern Command, which is basically the U.S. Navy branch, basically, well, the theater command is the whole military, but focused basically on the U.S. Navy. And they basically try and prevent things from getting into the Caribbean basin, getting towards the Mississippi, the whole Mississippi system, all that kind of stuff. That's Cuba, that's South America. So this is a whole part of the U.S. military that no one really thinks about, but deep down, it's actually maybe the most crucial. This is what the United States focused on before it was a globe-spanning force. So there's something very honest and authentic about this questioning of what China's up to and what it might mean, because it's reaching deep into old questions and fears that the United States haven't had in a very long time. So the problem with all this is that it's just really misplaced, right? So you can talk about a country like China trying to, use diplomacy and, making bases in Sri Lanka and maybe adding them into Fiji or Djibouti, which is trying to do all this. It could try and recreate this entire thing that the United States created, particularly in after 1945. There's not. This is basically since the 1500s, but since the world opened up and you had, you just had sort of blue ocean, sailing. You had sort of deep water navigation. You had all this kind of stuff that let you go all around the world, anywhere. It started with, Vasco da Gama, started with Portuguese, and then it moved the Spanish and the Dutch and the British, and eventually everyone, the French, Germans, and then the Americans. The basic thing that every country's trying to do is, hey, let me become really powerful and put all sorts of nodes of my influence all around the world. in all sorts of key places, places like Gibraltar for the Mediterranean, or Djibouti, or Singapore, Buenos Aires, all these kinds of different places. This is kind of what's gone on. The real challenge is that most countries can never, ever control any of this. The Portuguese couldn't do it, the Spanish couldn't do it, the Dutch couldn't do it, the British could do it for a while, but then they couldn't do it. And then the only country that could is the United States. So basically, China would have to do exactly what the United States did to make all this work. And again, this isn't wrong. It's just what we're doing is we're assuming that every other country is like the United States. We assume that there's another large, powerful country, that its sort of idea of what to do will look exactly like the United States. And again, you do say, hey, the United States is the really powerful country. Let me imitate what they did. But you can't exactly do that. You kind of have to do your own thing. You have to do it in your own way, the way that sort of fits for who you are as a country. And the honest truth is that China is not creating a navy that's meant to sail into the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, I feel like I say this a lot, but the Chinese Navy has, it's starting to develop major ships that can go, let's say, to Hawaii. So the Type 55 destroyer cruiser, really massive ship, really impressive ship, probably the most impressive sort of single non-carrier, non-submarine ship that the Chinese have. It's called the Type 55 destroyer, but it's really big, so it's more like what America would call cruisers. These ships can reach basically Hawaii from China. That's really far range for the Chinese. Almost everything the Chinese have can't go anywhere near that distance. And so part of what this admiral is talking about is that for China to even start to be able to go around the world, well, it would need a lot of nuclear-powered cruisers, and carriers, and nuclear-powered all sorts of things if you could do it, including more nuclear attack submarines, all that kind of stuff, which they don't have. I mean, again, this is also why the United States has nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, so it can go all over the world without having to refuel. And it has nuclear-powered attack submarines, so it can go all around the world and not have to refuel. So this is a big reason why the United States has the style of Navy that it has, is to be able to operate in a sort of expeditionary manner all around the world. China has not done that. I mean, what it's trying to do with its Navy is primarily to conquer Taiwan and then to deal with all of its neighbors and to deal with sort of its own resource questions in local strategic areas like the Strait of Malacca, which is basically near Singapore, where it needs to get a lot of energy through. This is what the Chinese Navy is actually really trying to do. What's happening now is that the Chinese have so many needs all around the world. They have so many external markets that they need. They have so many foreign resources that they need. They have so many commodities that they need to bring into their country to process, that they need in different parts that they need to bring into their country to assemble into all the products that they sell all around the world, that you can't actually, like the need is starting to become almost American in the sense that we need to be everywhere around the world. Otherwise, we're just, we are beholden to something going wrong anywhere, and we can't do anything about it. So if something goes wrong in the Middle East and you can't get oil, China has no way to go send a navy to do anything to sort of act militarily to deal with any of these issues. And that's really difficult for a country to handle, especially as you're becoming as wealthy or developed in some ways as China is, or just basically as powerful as China is becoming. That's just tough to deal with. But the process of building out a massive military infrastructure, it's very different. China has to, it has to do this. It has to even be able to get to those bases. It has to be able to sort of man them and staff them. What China's kind of been up to is creating, the potential for different military bases. So the stuff it's done in Sri Lanka in particular, this is a great one. There's a sort of debt diplomacy, and basically China got a 90 or 99-year lease, which is funny because that's kind of what the British were doing in China back in the day. And 99-year leases, or 999-year lease, I can't remember right now. China's doing the same thing with a port in Sri Lanka. But the problem is, if you can't like that, you have to be able to defend that port. I mean, you have to be able to even get there. You have to be able to not let the Indians just destroy it right away because it's right next to all of their, it's within easy range of their entire military. You have to be able to support it and defend it. The United States is just in a very rare and unique position. All it has to do in North America is be relatively friendly with the Canadians and sort of make sure there's not too many narco troubles in, moving up from Mexico, and that's about it, right? You have problems with basically state breakdown in Central America, which is basically non-functioning states there. But that's about it. That doesn't require a giant military. And so you have open seas. You don't have island nations across your coast. You can do all sorts of things that you just can't do when you're China. So that is like really what people need to remember, is that when you're, especially if you're an American or you've been in the American Navy, which we're going to talk about in a second, like you always assume everyone else is just like America. That, yeah, everyone wants to be like the top dog in the world, but it's not something that most countries ever achieve. And China's never achieved it in the sense of being a global power. It's been very, very large regional power in a world where there was no global powers, right? You can't even really talk about global powers until, you know, the 1500s, basically. You can't until you can actually get around the globe, right? You could sort of poke your, you know, finger into different places. If you just kind of sat in your region and that was it, you're obviously a big dog, but you're not even really associated with other places. So that's a whole other thing. But don't buy any of that stuff that China was an ancient superpower. It doesn't make sense. There wasn't such thing as a national, you know, global superpower or global anything really at the time. So that applies to Rome. It applies to all that kind of stuff. But this is really, really the key. China, if people, everyone should be watching the Chinese Navy. It's very important, but you need to have some sort of structure here when you're talking about it. You can't just freak out and assume, wow, it's breaking out, and it's going to have massive military, massive Navy, massive all this. It's very different. I mean, even for China to, basically, there's something called the first island chain, where China has to basically punch past Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines and all the other countries before it can even send its Navy anywhere in a meaningful way. Everyone knows that. The Chinese know that more than anybody else, and it doesn't have the potential to do that right now. So really what China's doing in the background is trying to create ships that can go far enough to actually threaten anyone, right? Right now, the Chinese Navy can't even reach the United States, right? It can reach Hawaii, basically, with a couple ships. That's it. I mean, that's not what anyone's really talking about or thinking about, but that's really the truth. But the key thing here, and the reason all this is happening, the reason we have people freaking out, and again, it's Navy first, which is important. The American Navy has been totally out of whack for at least 25, going on 30 years probably. You know, what I mean is that obviously the United States Navy is the most powerful Navy in the world. That's fine. But the Navy has not known what exactly to do with itself for decades. It's actually kind of crazy. I mean, basically every single major naval acquisition in the last 30 years has been a disaster. It's been, I mean, you can talk about, so there's the submarines called the Seawolves, or Seawolf class submarine, whatever. There's only 3 of them built. Again, a lot of this stuff is just the end of the Cold War. So the U.S. Navy, the U.S. military downsized, and all sorts of massive programs that were under development got cut, and there were basically huge costs associated with building a few numbers of a few types of warfighting systems, weapon systems. So that means the B-2 bombers, you only got a few of them, they cost insane amounts of money, and also hit the Navy. So you also had the Seawolf submarine, basically built 3 of them for billions of dollars. But the problem with the Navy is just it's been kind of a series of these messes. So it has the sort of successor to the main destroyer that the U.S. has, which is Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. It's going to replace with this DDG 1000 Zumwalt thing. It's crazy. You guys probably seen it. It has like a triangle-looking top, and it's kind of stealthy-looking, although it's now covered in rust. But, you know, this thing, and it's another failure. It's like there's 3 of them. They're basically test platforms at this point and didn't work. And it just goes on. There's this whole concept called the Littoral combat system, or Littoral combat ship, and it was, you know, the LCS. This thing was just another disaster. The Navy built 2 types of a very small, weak ship with bad operations concepts, bad manning concepts, bad weapons, bad modular concepts. None of it worked, and it's been a disaster. They're basically writing off this entire program, and they're starting to writing off ships like some are, I think, maybe a decade old. It's actually pretty crazy, but that's what's happened. And it goes on. I mean, there's the forward carrier right now is having all of these teething problems. There's just fixing, you know, U.S. Navy air wings, and, you know, adding, you know, trying to add drones and unmanned aerial systems and unmanned underwater systems, and basically drone submarines, all this stuff. The Navy has just not been able to really figure it out. It hasn't been able to put it together, and it's not the problem of the Navy, but when you have so much, the overmatch, the ability to just wreck all your other opponents is so great. You really don't know what you're doing. I mean, the whole reason they were building littoral combat ships is basically because they thought they would be not fighting in the, you know, open water anymore, and they would be assisting sort of operations nearby the shore. And so they have, you know, the DDG 1000 had a giant like long range gun on it too, and all these things that just it missed, right? I mean, the Navy's missed it. The move to just these massive missile-based ships. I mean, this was actually seen in with the Soviets. The Soviets had a very similar paradigm of sort of how to deal with. Basically, the Soviets knew they couldn't have a giant navy, and so they figured out how to have an anti-navy to fight the United States. And China, in a lot of ways, its whole anti-access area denial thing that people talk about, how it's preventing the U.S. Navy from getting into the Western Pacific, all that. This is really an extension of the Soviet pattern of how do you keep the U.S. at bay. Well, you used a lot of submarines. They used a lot of submarines, and they used a lot of missiles, lots and lots and lots of missiles. And so the same reason that Russia has great anti-aircraft missiles to not and basically to knock out all sorts of American bombers, American planes, it has really, really great like supersonic anti-ship missiles. And it was the same thing. It's to knock out U.S. military, U.S. naval vessels. And so the Chinese have a very similar thing, particularly with the anti-naval, anti-ship, yeah, I mean, just great missiles. They use ballistic missiles for it. They use all sorts of stuff. And there's all these talk about carrier killing missiles and all this stuff. And it's all worthwhile. But the general thing has been there's been such an explosion in the capacity of missiles, of the electronics on missiles, the guidance, the all of this, that it's just really changed a lot of naval operations, because you have missiles that can be flying from everywhere, and they're extremely powerful, they're extremely long range, and they really changed the dynamic. And the U.S. Navy, not only has it not been focused on this, it actually has really, really old missiles of its own. Like, it's only in the last basically, let's just say 7 years, that it's been thinking about China again, that it's actually starting to create new anti-ship missiles, stealthy missiles, long-range missiles, all this kind of stuff. And obviously, talking about missiles gets a little weird, but this really matters. You have all sorts of stuff that's going on right now. And so basically what I'm getting at is the U.S. Navy lost sight of what it's trying to do. It lost sight of what a Navy is. It lost sight of why the U.S. has the Navy that it has. It lost sight of what the U.S. Navy is supposed to be doing in particular, because it actually succeeded so thoroughly for so long that it didn't even remember actually what it was supposed to be doing. And that's a crazy thing to say, but it's entirely true. And admirals like Stavridis and James Stavridis and a lot of other ones, they weren't really naval commanders in a time when they knew they had to think about what the U.S. Navy was or what it was doing. And so it's very good that they go back to, people like Alfred Thayer Mann. They go, they're starting to think again, oh my God, what about the Caribbean basin? Things like this. This is a sign that a deeper sense of what's needed is coming back, which is actually a good thing. And these admirals know that the core here is that they know they dropped the ball, basically. They know all this stuff I'm talking about, all these problems, all this stuff. You're like, okay, let's build a $12 billion carrier. What if China launches 5 missiles at it and you just can't defend it and it just dies, right? Obviously, it's not that simple. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about with hypersonic missiles, how they actually work and whether they're as threatening as people are making them out to be. That's a whole thing. And there's a whole military operation. All of the military is in flux right now because it's finally, it describes it as a near peer competitor, right? Basically, it actually started with the Trump administration. 2016, they put out a new strategy, basically the U.S. military strategy. It says we're now in an era of we're going to have to fight real competitive threats again, near peer states, I think is the term. And they say Russia and China, but it's not Russia. It's entirely China. They don't just say China because it would seem like the entire U.S. military is gearing up to fight China, which seems just a bit maybe not what the U.S. military wants to say, but it's the truth. Russia is not in the same ball game, not playing the same game. Right? This is the Soviet Union was far more powerful than Russia was, and even that could compete with they couldn't compete with the United States, and the remaining. Russia's it's a disaster. Like if we're talking about a massive conflict, global conflict between a country, two countries, China versus the United States, and an actual conflict versus China, U.S. versus Russia, it's just not a thing. But anyway, the U.S. you have to say near peer states. You have to make it plural so you don't sound kind of like you're just preparing for a massive war against the red communists of China. But that's how it looks. And so this is all good. This sense of wow, things went wrong, and what should the U.S. Navy be doing? What should the U.S. military be doing? What should it be focusing on? This is actually a good thing, but the truth is, if you're just reading news articles and listening to guys like these, you're never actually going to learn what's happening. Like, what is actually the deeper roots of this stuff? What's really happening is that everyone is just freaking out about China and talking about it every day and then relating everything you need to China. So maybe the U.S. needs to liberalize its sort of Bitcoin and crypto policies because China may come and totally usurp the U.S. place in global payments and stuff like that. And the same thing for the military, and same thing for going to space, and blah blah blah. It's everything, which obviously is just a cop out, but it doesn't really matter. But the core thing here, beneath all this, is how does a country decide what its military looks like, right? So this is what we've been talking about. So the U.S. has been sort of, ambling around in the Middle East and doing all these stupid things. Didn't seem to make a difference, and now it's trying to figure out what its military needs to look like, and so it's basically reorienting it to fight China, and that's fine. But the real question is, what should your military look like? Period. Like, what does it look like without? Obviously, you always use a competitor in some sense, but you also don't really need to in the same way. Every country has a sort of basic military structure that's handed down by its history and its geography and its demography. All of this is actually there. So it's this. Japan has a specific military that it does because of these reasons. China is kind of like the United States, and it's trying to have a military that it can't really create or sustain, but it also feels like it has no choice because of the sort of present economic conditions. But the history and the geography are all against it, and the demography. But that's it. And so, it's way easier to see this sort of thing in the past. You say, oh, like the Greek city-states, they need a certain type of military. That's kind of obvious, right? If you're the Ottoman Empire, well, you probably need something to. If you're the Mongols, you probably need a lot of horses, all this kind of stuff. You probably don't need that kind of thing. You don't need a navy, whatever. But these things, like, you think it's just gone and it's past. It's actually not. It's a lot more complex today, but the basic structure of how you get what you're talking about is still there. And we need to remember this stuff, because otherwise you're just going to always be freaking out. And then when the China threat is gone one day, you're like, oh, like, what are we now? It's all a waste. Let's just get rid of everything. Let's not know. And you can't be doing this forever. You have to actually know what the roots of this stuff is. Otherwise it just goes on forever and it just gets kind of like a farce. But ever since the end of the Cold War, that hasn't happened. And what we're going to have now is just kind of a Cold War 2.0 style of military development. Everything's going to be geared towards China, which, in an interesting way, for a lot of reasons, this may correlate anyway with what the U.S. does. A lot of what's going to happen in the next 10 years as the U.S. tries to reorient to fight China is it's going to create systems that help it deal with the massive distances associated with the Pacific Ocean. So just getting from the U.S. to China is a big deal. Or the China to the U.S. the same way. All the continents on Earth can fit inside the Pacific Ocean. It is so big, it's like unfathomably big, right? And so it's massive, right? And that creates all sorts of things. Crossing these distances, making systems that are survivable, that can know where they are, that can deal with other systems, that are interoperable. There's a lot of things that the U.S. is going to have to solve that are going to be that are going to actually really define the U.S. military probably till like 2050, at least till the 2040s, because that's just the way things work. And that probably will correlate, like I'm saying, with sort of the deeper structure of why the U.S. military is the way it is. So the basic thing to end this is that China, it's not going to have a bunch of military ships, so it's not going to have naval vessels floating past California, or sailing past Cuba, or up the Florida coast. Like, that's not really what's happening. China's trying to create a military that's going to be impossible for it to maintain, particularly its navy. That is going to be, and we're going to probably watch it fail in the next 10 years. The U.S. is imagining that China is going to succeed and create something just like the United States, which is motivating the United States to create something to counter it, which is not wrong. Basically, you're saying, well, what would we do if our competitor was like us in the way we imagine? And you're actually not super off, because you're basically saying, hey, let me shadow box with myself and improve. That's not the worst thing in the world. But what's better in the end is not getting freaked out about these articles of Chinese naval domination. That's not what you need to worry about. That's really not what people should be thinking about. The key thing for people listening is basically, if you want to kind of know more about learn about what the U.S. is and what it's about, and what China is and what it's about, and what kind of countries in general are, and what kind of helps define their character over time and through history, you got to look at something else. So just learn. It's better. You're gonna see all these articles for a long time. Probably gonna see these for the next at least 3-4 years, depending on how things go in China. That, get ready. It's going to be all this stuff. The Chinese it's a massive push right now, and the military is massively expanding. So it's not wrong to focus on this. I'm not minimizing what's going on. I'm just trying to say the set of challenges that China faces aren't acknowledged in these articles typically. And what they're actually saying is they're assuming that they have the minimal, impediments to military action that just like the United States does, whereas you just don't have all the many things that get in your way, and you could just go to war in Afghanistan for decades and not even have interest rates rise in your country. It's like, well, that's not ever how things typically happen. So just think about that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you want to learn kind of more about countries, about China, about the United States, definitely subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be putting out more stuff about this kind of stuff. Check out the China Unraveled podcast, where I go kind of into sort of deep dives on different issues. There's a cool one coming out soon. Also check out interviews I do on different podcasts, different YouTube channels, Twitch streams, all that. Definitely stay tuned for future courses I'm going to create online, I've been getting a lot of requests for basically like, hey, just put this stuff into a small package that sort of lays it all out systematically, and people can go and you can just look afterwards. You can open up Google Earth or Google Maps and just look around the world and have it start to make sense and start to see beyond all of these endless headlines and the prefactured narratives that you see everywhere. So check that out. Also check me out on Twitter. Subscribe again to this channel here on YouTube. And